Films in Focus with David Sterritt is underwritten by The Movie House, your destination for first-run Hollywood and independent movies, and a digital portal to the Met Opera, National Theatre Live, and special events worldwide in Millerton, New York, and on the web, themoviehouse.net.
David Sterritt is the editor-in-chief of the Quarterly Review of Film and Video, contributing writer at Cineast, film professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and, possessively, Robin Hood Radio's very own critic. He joins us weekly. The films Sobibor and Pet Sematary. Hi, David. How are you?
Okay, Joe. How you doing this week?
Boo.
Ooh, boy, yeah, spooky stuff today. Although these films are very, very different, but they're both at heart in the way they're structured and presented. They're basically melodramas. But the first one, Sobibor, is certainly the more to be taken the more seriously of the two, because it is named after and takes place at a Nazi death camp. Sobibor was the name of a death camp that was in Poland during the Nazi occupation. And what happened back in 1943 was that some Russian inmates at Sobibor led an escape, which was actually successful. And I recently read in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that there were actually two escapes that were successful that took place. There's this sort of myth afoot that the Jews never fought back during the Holocaust, but in fact there were a couple of successful escapes that took place in 1943. The other one was at the much better known Treblinka, but interestingly, Sobibor was the smallest of the death camps that the Nazis built in Poland, and after the escape, the Nazis just completely destroyed the entire camp. So that is why it's less well known than Treblinka or places like Auschwitz and so forth, because it was small to begin with, and then the Nazis totally destroyed it. But it was there, and in fact, there was an important film about it quite a number of years ago, way back in 2001. The very, very great filmmaker Claude Lanzmann, who made the 9-hour Holocaust documentary Shoah, made a sort of a follow-up film called Sobibor, October 14th, 1943, 4 p.m., which is also about this. Now, the Lanzmann film is very, very straightforward. Lanzmann does not use reenactments or dramatizations or even archival footage. He deals with witness testimony. And the movie that I'm talking about right now, Sobibor, is a very different kind of a movie because it is very much kind of a melodramatic recreation of this whole event. It is basically a Russian film. It's an international co-production, but it was made by Konstantin Khablensky, and it deals with this uprising at Sobibor in 1943. And what we have is a pretty graphic and extended depiction of the horrors of the camp, the Nazi guards, the various prisoners, and so forth. And we have a very important character who is a Jewish officer in the Red Army, whose name is Alexander Petrsky. He's known as Sasha, and he has been transferred there from the Minsk ghetto. And he manages to get together a group of fellow prisoners who plot and scheme to rebel against their Nazi guards and to effect some kind of escape, and they are successful at this. Now, most of the movie deals with the horrors of the camp and with the organizing of this uprising. And the Nazis get most of the screen time. And of course, as always, they are portrayed in very kind of over-the-top ways as being very evil and dehumanizing people and so forth. And all of that, I'm sure, is quite accurate. But we also have these prisoners who are doing their best to try to rally themselves and to figure out how they might rebel against this and how some of them might even get out. This movie has not gotten a whole lot of reviews. It's pretty much coming out now. But the stuff that's been written about the film has sort of tended to focus, I think, on this sort of orgy scene where the guards are all getting totally blasted out with alcohol and setting up this kind of carnivalesque horror where the Jews have to pull them around in carts, or they ride around on the Jews like horses and so forth. And this kind of thing, I think, goes beyond the bounds, shall we say, of tasteful recreation of what these things were like. It becomes a kind of a cinematic, excessively cinematic scene. But then we finally get around to the escape itself, and it's handled reasonably well, again, in a melodramatic way. But at least the movie kind of settles down and becomes more serious and less, more exploring the situation than exploiting the situation. So overall, I would say that Sobibor, there can never be too many movies about the Holocaust. This movie taught me a bit about this camp, which I had not known before. And parts of it are effectively acted, and parts of it are effectively directed, and other parts of it, again, are kind of excessive. Interestingly, the director, Kavinsky, also plays Pechersky, who organizes the escape. And it's good to see some of these people finally get out of this horrible place, even though in the end it didn't make any real difference in the total overall horrors of the Holocaust. At least it shows, and this movie reminds us, that there were some Jews who rebelled against the horrors of the Holocaust and who successfully rebelled and even escaped the whole thing. And it's always good to be reminded that happened at least once in a while during the Holocaust. I look forward, though, in the future to seeing and learning from more serious, more kind of successfully conceptualized treatments of the Holocaust. Now let us turn to our other movie for today, which is Pet Sematary, which is based on a novel by Stephen King. So many Stephen King novels have been made into movies, and some of the short stories as well. And they are of widely varying quality. Stephen King, of course, specializes in horror, and Stephen King movies are obviously horror movies. And the novel Pet Sematary, I actually think is definitely one of the better Stephen King novels. I would put it maybe on almost the level of The Shining and The Stand, which I think are the best of the many Stephen King novels that I've read. Pet Sematary is almost on that level. It was made into a movie before, back in 1989, with a screenplay, in that case, by Stephen King himself. He adapted his own novel. And I have to say about that 1989 adaptation of Pet Sematary, it is just a terrible, terrible movie. It is so bad. The acting is bad. The lighting is bad. The camera work is bad. Everything about it is bad. I liked nothing about that earlier movie. And so I wasn't really sure how the new remake of Pet Sematary was going to be, and I'm happy to report it's a much better movie. I don't think it's as good as a lot of critics are saying it is. It's really been extremely well received, but it is a whole lot better than the earlier adaptation, and it really is one of the better one of the better Stephen King movies. Not as good as the greatest Stephen King movie, which is The Shining, directed by the great Stanley Kubrick. Certainly not remotely as good as that, but it's still a pretty darn good movie if you like horror movies. I certainly do recommend it. Now, an interesting thing about the novel Pet Sematary is that Stephen King wrote an introduction to it in which he reveals that of all of his novels, he said when he wrote this introduction to Pet Sematary, he said readers seem to find The Shining to be the scariest of his novels. And, that's probably accurate. I probably agree. I think it probably is the scariest of his novels. But Stephen King said that for him, the scariest of his novels was Pet Sematary. And he said when he finished writing Pet Sematary, he thought to himself, this time maybe I actually have gone too far, and kind of put it in a drawer and was reluctant to even publish it, although, of course, eventually he did publish it. It became, a very successful Stephen King novel. So I've always found that very, very interesting. The movie where Stephen King himself was a bit freaked out by his own creation of a horror story. I sort of see what he means, and I don't want to get into spoiler territory here, but kind of a key line in the novel of Pet Sematary, and also it's very much a key line in the new movie of Pet Sematary, is sometimes dead is better. So a movie that suggests that to be dead is maybe better than the alternative. It's a kind of a scary notion. And I think, that roughly speaking is what Stephen King had in mind. That said, beyond, the kind of lurking horror of its sort of basic message, I think Pet Sematary just works very well, the novel, as a horror story. It pulls you in, it scares you, it makes you tingle. And the new movie does reasonably well at that, too. Haven't mentioned, by the way, which I should mention in case anybody out there hasn't seen all the jillions of ads and things for this movie, that Pet Sematary is spelled in a funny way. It is spelled Sematary, Pet Cemetery. It is about a pet cemetery, but it is about a pet cemetery that was originally set up by children, and they misspelled the word cemetery, which is easy to misspell, on the sign that brings you into the pet cemetery. And so both the novel and the movie have that. And I was reluctant, actually, for a long time to read the novel because I thought that title was sort of childish, more childish than childlike. But actually, there is nothing childish or childlike about the story that it tells. So now about that story. Okay, Pet Cemetery deals with a married couple named Louis and Rachel. They are played in the new movie by Jason Clarke and Amy Seimetz. And they have just moved to a rural town in Maine. Well, I guess it's more of kind of a small city or large town or something like that, out in Maine, where, of course, Stephen King has always hailed from. And they move into their new house with their two very young children, a little girl who's about to turn 9, a little boy who's about 2. They get to know their neighbor across the way, whose name is Judd, who is played in the movie by the wonderful John Lithgow, who is still such a wonderful actor. And they settle into their new lives. Louis is a physician who has taken a new job in the community. And one of the earlier things that happens in both the novel and the movie is that their pet cat, whose name is Church, which is short for Winston Churchill, their cat gets run over by a truck on the very, very busy highway that happens to run past their lovely home. Their lovely home is sort of out in the country, but there is this very busy road down which oil trucks are always tooling. So the cat gets killed by one of the oil trucks. And the little girl is about to be really bereft. The little girl who's about to turn 9 years old. She loves this cat, and how are they going to tell her that the cat died? And the neighbor across the way, who has been very taken with the little girl, whose name is Ellie, and it feels bad that she's going to feel all upset when she finds out her cat is dead, clues Louis, the father of the family, into this little secret which the local people know. They bury the cat in the pet cemetery, which was set up by local kids to bury their pets in when their pets pass away. Then, however, he reveals to Louis and sort of escorts Louis on this mission. They dig up the cat, and they take the cat to a remoter place out in the woods, and they rebury the cat and set up a little cairn, and the next thing you know, the cat is back again in their lives. The cat has come back to life. The cat, which appears to still be dead, is not acting like its old self. It is now very mean and nasty and is sort of a monster cat, but it appears to be alive again. And the little girl is no longer so bereft until she starts to realize that her cat is no longer the nice old cat, but is now a sort of a new monster cat. So all of that is in the sort of the beginning of the movie. And then, again, I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but something very traumatic and horrifying happens to the family that goes way beyond the death of a pet cat. And the pet cemetery and that mysterious other burial ground, it's an old Indian burial ground, sort of a cliche there, out in the woods, turns out to have very, very magical powers. And when you are buried there, you are not necessarily buried for keeps. And before you know it, we have a real horror story going here. Now, interestingly, in the novel, something very horrifying happens to one of the children. And the new movie, in adapting the novel, makes a very, very big change, which enables there to be all kinds of violence involving one of the children later on that would not be quite as plausible if not for this particular change made in the novel. I know I sound a little bit mysterious here, but I'm not trying not to give away too much of the plot. The main thing I want to say here is that whereas the earlier movie version of Pet Sematary, which is very bad, was actually written by Stephen King, the new movie of Pet Sematary, which, by the way, was produced by my old friend Stephen Schneider. It's nice to know he is still very active in the horror movie realm. The new movie has a screen story in addition to a screenplay, both of which are not by Stephen King. So although this is recognizably an adaptation of the Stephen King novel, there's all kinds of changes made. It is really a very, very different thing that ultimately goes in different directions. Now, if you've read the novel, if you're a real Stephen King admirer, then the movie will have some real surprises for you, because some of the changes that are wrought in the original novel are pretty clever, and effectively make the thing fresh and new in various ways. I found the first half of the new Pet Sematary to be rather dull, treading over familiar territory, very similar to the novel, very similar to the earlier film of Pet Sematary, and more important than that, rather flatly filmed, not very exciting, the acting not very good. The second half of the movie gets real spooky. So again, I think that the new Pet Sematary is a movie that absolutely improves as it goes along. The second half is very, very effective. There's a whole lot of over-the-top gore, so this is not a movie for the faint of heart, but it's a mainstream Hollywood film, so it's within the bounds of the usual modern-day horror genre. So I can say overall that Pet Sematary is not one of the great horror movies, but it's a very good horror movie, and if you like to be scared, it'll do a bit of that for you, and I hope you have a good time at it. And so that is my somewhat horrifying story this week, Jill.
Thank you so much, David Sterritt. Films in Focus, the films Sobibor and Pet Sematary.